Right, we're recording.
Weird, it's never done that before.
No, it hasn't. Should we keep that in? No,
Why
because
not?
we have to credit someone
Yeah.
else then. No, this is our show.
Yeah, true.
Or better still, I'll just replace that random voice with my own.
Yeah.
Right, hello and welcome back, to our show. The Scott and Loz show, that is. As if you didn't know by now, as we're on episode 11. And hello to you as well, Loz.
All right there.
And so he's Loz, I'm Scott, and that can only mean one thing. We are Scott, Loz, and Loz. You just heard the first of a series of new jingles there, which Loz and I recently recorded, which I'll just include as and when, I guess, Loz, because, well, frankly, some of them are ridiculous, aren't they?
Oh, sure.
They kind of got sillier as we went along, really. They started out relatively normal, like that one. And I guess for that reason, I'll probably just introduce them in the order in which we recorded them.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, we started with a few introductory ones like that, and then, well, by the time we got to the end, we had a raft of ones which I genuinely don't know where they're going to fit in. I'll find a way, but it won't be cohesive, I can assure you that.
But I mean, like all of it, we enjoyed doing it, so that's all the motivation I need.
Yeah, and I suppose while we're on the topic of jingles, at this stage, I don't think we can bin the original one, can we? Because it's
Why would you?
It's just got its talons in now, isn't it?
Mm.
I mean, we've let it settle in, to be fair. It would be kind of cruel to ask it to leave now, don't you think?
Yeah, it's got squatters' rights.
Yeah. Now, Loz, that little intro we did there may have sounded all too familiar to you and I. And, well, that's because, well, I shall now turn to address you, the listener. Unbeknownst to you, Loz and I actually did convene last week and recorded this episode, and indeed the following one. But sadly, due to issues once again with my microphone, I think, we couldn't use either of them. I mean, I tried to make it work, but it was just, I couldn't sign it off from quality control,
Yeah.
it was too crackly. It was hard not to fixate on it. I would have been annoyed with it throughout the rest of the show's existence. So I thought, let's cut our losses, get this right. So I do apologize. That now I hope explains the fact there was no new episode last Sunday. We did kind of have two in the bag, or so we thought. And yeah, believe me, I tried to salvage them, but I'm just not a miracle worker. And I mean,
it was peppered right throughout, wasn't it? It wasn't even just like a little bit. I mean, that anytime we speak, frankly, anybody should listen, whether it's on a podcast or in real life. But in terms of quality, it would probably have irritated more people than it had helped. So
definitely, yeah. And if I say something, I want it to be heard. Not like
exactly.
And in fact, there's a quote, Lars. I can't remember who said it, but it's something like, after food, water, and oxygen, the most basic human need is to be heard. And I was quite liked that. Maybe that's why we're doing this podcast. I don't know.
It just felt a little bit to me, obviously being on the other end of it, it sounded like some sort of rat was trying to eat your microphone as you were podcasting. And I was amazed at your professionalism as you managed to continue on without, referencing this distraction. Then we found out that it was a problem.
Yeah, I couldn't really hear it. I had no notion of it going on, at the time. So that's why we continued to record about 2 hours worth of material. And then, it was only an edit, whilst, of course, far too late by that point. I mean, honestly, I used to work in IT for like 5 years. So not only was it highly frustrating, but almost like a blow to my pride as well, really. I mean, honestly, I don't understand how, if you have a good headset and a decent enough laptop, you can't just plug said headset into said laptop and it works. It's not like I'm sat in a fucking paddling pool or on the runway of Heathrow Terminal 5 or something. There shouldn't be any interference, but there just was throughout. And
politely, I did mention it a couple of times, and I was just like, right, okay.
Yes, and I owe you an apology, Lars, really, because I berated your listening skills, didn't I? When just an episode prior, and then and then this time round, you noted the fact that this was happening, and I just all but dismissed it. So a second apology in order there, really, Lars. So
we're older and wiser, we move on, and we'll rewind.
And so I am using that new microphone setup that I, of course, started within what would be the last episode to you, the listener, episode 10. But it just doesn't feel like the last episode to us, does it, Loz?
Yeah, no.
So anyway, yes, Loz, I trust you'll inform me if any of the same issues arise. And should they do so, I guess I'll just immediately disconnect this bastard and just switch back to the laptop mic, because that worked okay, and I'll just switch back to that setup until I can identify the problem, which, let's face it, is probably me somehow, isn't it? I mean, so I'll try and keep totally still throughout this, but I'm kind of a natural born perennial fidgeter, really. So just see how it goes.
Yeah, play it by ear.
Right, anyway,
Literally.
that's business out of the way. About 6 minutes or
Indeed.
so, probably about par. All right. So, as I said at the end of the last episode, this is kind of like, well, we left you amidst a tour, didn't we, or a festival, as I called it. We had the Honourable trilogy of film mentions, and this is like the Honourable festival of musical mentions. And yeah, some really quite different bands that I feel deserved some limelight before we actually got into our top 10 albums of all time, which largely won't feature these bands, or, well, to be honest, won't really at all. And so you join us at the start of day 2. And of course, Loz and I have done the dress rehearsal for this, so we should be well oiled for this. Come on.
Should be.
Filth, no more of that. And so there'll be no surprises for Loz this time. Well, I say that. There'll be no surprises with the bands that I've proverbially? Is that the word? Is that a word?
It is a word.
Is it a word? So Loz, there should be no surprises to you or for you with the lineup for today, day 2. But should you remember them, it's not really a problem, is it? I mean, we haven't got to the top 10 yet, where the element of mystery is really quite key, I'd say.
Well, I mean, being a professional as I am, obviously I should remember everything in its exact order. But also, knowing myself as I do, if I remember anything more than the title, then I'll be quite impressed.
Yeah, we'll just have to see. We'll have to see. But there's no pressure either way.
Suck it and see.
So, all right, then let's quiz you immediately on this. Can you remember what opened day 2 last time, Loz? It's quite a chilled way to open proceedings for the day.
I think it was no, absolutely blank.
So they're a band that I think would deserve the moniker of the most beautiful band ever. Just to kick things off with the typical Scott Bold claim, but honestly, I really do consider these guys possibly the most cerebral band, and it's a band we've all heard. If anyone's watched any of the BBC nature shows, they'll have heard this band because they're kind of mainstays on there. And that is, of course, a huge clue as to who I'm talking about here. It's the Icelandic band Sigur Rós.
Ah, yes.
And I mean, if you don't think you've heard this band before, just search like Hoppy Polla, if that's how you pronounce it. I won't tell you how to spell it either. I'll let you have fun with that for yourself. But in fact, I can play this on guitar, so I'll stick the intro in here, and I'm sure you'll recognise it. And Loz, just for continuity purposes, just say something like, "Oh yes, I've heard that before."
Oh yeah, that's the one.
Jubbly. That's typically unprofessional.
Yes.
So that tune comes from probably their most famous album. And it's one that I always thought was top 10. And I'm still kind of stunned it isn't. I think it would maybe make 11 or 12. I mean, if I think back to the last, the day 1, if you like, of this festival, it was in Absentia by Porcupine Tree that I think I said, this was number 11. I don't think it is. I think this is, to be honest,
10.5.
Yeah, so let's effectively call this number 11 for now, because it's the Sigur Rós album Tak, which is TAKK, which translates to thank you in Icelandic, actually. And that kind of sums this record up perfectly. It's like a hug, a warm hug of an album. It'll kind of lift the darkest of times. It really is that kind of record that can make you feel amazing, regardless of what situation you're in at the time. I
Wow.
can't remember. You were talking about Terminator 2, Loz, when you said, "Oh, if aliens land, this is the action film I would show to them." And I think if we switched that scenario to like music, and I was faced with the dilemma of putting on an album of beauty, one that celebrates everything that our species is capable of in terms of beauty through a musical output, I don't think I'd think twice about putting Tack on.
Right.
In fact, I mean,
and still not even in the top 10.
Yes,
Good Lord.
I know. In fact, this scenario happened. I don't know if you've seen The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Yes.
Yeah, well, Keanu Reeves was basically the spokesperson, if you like, for the aliens that were about to completely extinguish the entire human race. And he's in John Cleese's office, and he's got some, to be honest with you, quite inane jazz piano noodling on in the background. But Keanu Reeves is like, "This is beautiful," and that's like the turning point for him, thinking, "Oh, maybe these humans are worth sticking with for just another decade."
Yeah.
But anyway, I would have put Tack on in that situation, not whatever that was. So, I mean, the very first thing on the album, the intro, is just sums it up perfectly. It's stunning. And then, in particular, there's one later on that's called, it's probably my favorite on the album. I've got no idea how to apologize. How to apologize? I've got no idea how to pronounce this. It's Savo Yacht. Let's go with that. It's spelled SVO and then JHOTT. So it was a reasonable effort. Apologies to our Icelandic listeners if I've butchered that.
What are you saying, Google Translate?
Svo hot.
Tack.
But it's so moving. I can't tell you that song. And the whole album, it's incredible. It really is top 10 material, even though it didn't make the top 10. They did another album, which I just quickly want to mention, which is, it's untitled, or it kind of goes by the name of Brackets, because the name of the album on paper in text form is the brackets symbols. So I don't really know what you call that. Some people call it untitled, others call it Brackets.
Open brackets, close brackets.
Yeah, I mean, there's a strong case for that being their best album, to be fair. Certainly got the most epic climax on it, which they filmed live. They've done a DVD, which was a sequence of really many interesting performances across Iceland. And I'd strongly urge you check that out. It's called Heima, which means home in Icelandic. Guarantee you'll have seen nothing like it. So anyway, that's Sigur Rós.
Nice.
Thoughts, Loz? Or shall we get cracking straight into the next one?
No. I was. Funnily enough, I was just thinking to myself that the brackets thing was the first thing that's really rung a bell so far. So I was just like, right, yes, I'm back in the zone.
Oh, I see. From the last time we did this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember having that discussion. I'm glad that. Well, that might maybe that means a good bit of consistency on my part.
Indeed, because irritatingly, we did quite a good episode. Well, good couple of episodes. So but. We're getting stuck in the past. Let's blast on.
Yeah, exactly. Let's just make them better. Yeah. So
and it.
All right. Well, let's. And again, it's like working a set list, isn't it? With this, at least that's how I've seen it. So let's stick with the beautiful. Yeah. God, I can't talk today. Let's stick with a beautiful artist that, again, very cathartic to listen to. But equally, let's kind of switch it up at the same time, because a band like Sigur Rós are very sort of organic in their makeup and sound. And whilst this band, if you could call them a band, well, you can't really call them a band, also very organic sounding, they actually do it via an entirely different, almost opposite approach, which is through electronics, computers, plugins, yada, yada, and very rarely any kind of proper instrument. But these guys are absolutely up there as like one of my favorite artists. I mean, if we were doing it top 10 artists, I think they'd make the top 5, to be honest. And it's two English gentlemen. It's two English gentlemen as well. And Loz, are you going to remember who these guys are?
Is it?
You're right on the cusp.
Oh no. I want to say a name, and as soon as I know, I'm going to say this name is going to be the other name that I almost sort of associate with that. Right, I've got Daft Punk in my head, and I cannot get rid of it. I know I'm not far off.
Yeah, you're not far off, and yet you're a light year off at the same time. We're talking about Plaid.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, I was far off. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're talking about Plaid. And right,
I've never heard you talk about Daft Punk.
I know. I'll tell you what, when I was at high school, their first album came out and I digged it or dug it, like everyone else did at the time. Quite liked it. But no, I've probably not spoken about Daft Punk since.
Let's keep it that way.
I've got nothing against them. I think they're pretty good, but it's just they're for me, they're not worth talking about in the same breath as Plaid.
No.
So right, charge your glasses, because these guys, and I'll say it perhaps more wholeheartedly than I've said so far on this show, are criminally underrated. Or criminally underheard, perhaps, would be best. I don't know. Both, really, as I see it. Those who are into this genre of music, they fall into a category, I suppose you'd have to call IDM, which stands most irritatingly for intelligent dance music. You call prog pretentious. And Plaid are on a label called Warp Records, who are better known for the likes of Aphex Twin. I think Boards of Canada are on there, Orteka, Clark, who I do like, to be fair. But no, by far my favourite on the Warp label is Plaid. Always have been. And I know a good few people who aren't particularly into electronic music as such, but I've introduced, to these guys, and they've really, really liked them. I think because Plaid kind of cover in many ways the whole spectrum of this type of music, light and dark and everything in between. I mean, there are a couple of darker tracks that they've done that I particularly love. Like Zeal is one that comes to mind, spelled Z-E-A-L. But it's probably their lighter stuff that I tend towards, because much like Sigur Rós, it's just gorgeous, so relaxing. Puts me in a quite incredible state of euphoria. In that sense, it's almost like the audio equivalent of an MDMA come up, really, but better than that, because this doesn't wear off.
And there's no come down.
No. So yeah, Plaid have got an extensive catalogue of albums, and they've worked with the likes of Björk, but I guess to try and sort of bring this to a conclusion with an album as such. In fact, no, let me focus on two, I think, if that's okay, that just sum up why I love these guys so much. One was a soundtrack they did to a Japanese film called Tek on Concrete, which means black and white, I think. But I don't think it exists on Spotify, but it is available on the likes of YouTube. Although really, I'd recommend just watching the film, to be honest, so you get the full experience, because it's a marvelous film. But the music they did for that, my God, like if you do decide to check out the soundtrack off the back of this, which of course I hope you do, the first 4 tracks on that album are just eargasmic for me. And they're all quite different in their own way. So in that sense, it kind of gets to showcase what they're about. I mean, a better known artist in this field is Bonobo. And I've seen Bonobo live, but one of my great regrets so far is that I haven't seen Plaid, because they are my absolute favourites in this genre. And, I also think objectively by far the best and the most versatile. And so let me just mention my other favourite release of theirs, which is a proper Plaid studio album. And it's a fairly recent one, actually. It's called Ricci Prince. I would say do check that out. It kind of flows wonderfully. I mean, when it comes to electronic artists, you kind of venture into that playlist mentality, don't you? Which could work here very well on this album again. But Ricci Prince is, for me, like a proper album, a proper journey, one that works best from the very start to the very end. It's probably my favourite thing they've ever done. But we're in the business of recommending a particular track, aren't we, Lars? I forgot we were doing that. So actually, I'll tell you what, I would I'll go back to the first album I mentioned, the Tek on Concrete soundtrack, and I'd check out
Well, to be fair, I was really only worried about our top 10 for recommending a track, but you feel free, my boy.
No, I'll try and do it across these as well. I would say check out This City Is Hell, which I think is track 3. In fact, I'll learn it on guitar and just stick it in here. It's very. The reason I say that one is because it's very gentle and ambient, and it's a good example of kind of like the beauty in their music. So that's just a nice, very easy introduction, I guess, to their kind of aesthetic. So, or if you want a darker one, check out Zeal, like I said.
Sure.
Because the way that builds, it's just it. They have this incredible knack of like just building and adding things, but you don't necessarily realize they're even doing it. And then you get from point A to point B, let's say, I don't know, 90 seconds later, and it's almost like an altogether different thing, but you don't quite know how it's got there, because just the way they introduce little things each bar that just, Zeal is a perfect example of that. I love it.
Yes, you do.
So,
but I tell you one thing I do not love, Hughes, and that is something that has jogged loose in my memory. When talking about sort of intelligent dance music, I think it is somewhat of an apt moniker, because there are parts of sort of dance music and certain types of electronic music that do, certainly for me, whether I'm being prejudiced or not, but do tend to lean towards the more brainless of society. And never more was this more finely illustrated than during my brief 48-hour window as a double glazing salesman.
I'm so glad you. Go on.
And
this is what I was looking ahead to earlier, you see, and I was thinking, I wonder if Floz will remember that we have this chat about. Yeah, go on.
It's all coming back to me, baby. So this guy, in shorthand, he was an arsehole. And he drove a BMW because he thought that as a salesman he should drive a BMW, but it wasn't a nice BMW. He just drove it because it had the badge on the front. The inside was just a complete mass of sort of energy drink cans and sort of just crap everywhere, and like cigarette ends that it was not cared for. It was hardly his treasured possession.
I know the inside of someone's car says more about them than the outside, so that's that. In fact, in this case, it's both, isn't it? Combined are really quite telling. I've got quite an idea about this individual.
And he'd I think that the most he'd done was fit, whether it was a sub in the back or what it was. My Christ, he was playing this sort of mindless drum and bass, and at sort of a volume that made the windows rattle, and pulling up in sort of like quiet Upton to go around and canvass people for double glazing. I was just like, what are we doing? I mean, what sort of character is this?
Well, I refer you back to that quote, whoever it was that I paraphrased earlier. One of the most basic human needs is to be heard, and that manifests in different ways, doesn't it? People like that caliber of person just love making a racket, I think, and like they almost don't care what people think of them. They just want to be thought of. Do you know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah.
Anyway,
notice me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just was overcome with the sense of how artless it was. I mean, I'm someone who, I love Lil Jon, and there's a lot of people that would probably argue that there's not a lot of art in Lil Jon. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. But this stuff, it really was sort of, I could feel my brain cells sort of reverberating into nothingness. And by the end of the day, this guy attempted to sort of like prove that he was the master salesman, and had got taken in by this little old lady. And he tried as he might to constantly, to pillory this poor old lady with, oh wow, perhaps we might do double glazing here, or have you thought about a new door? What about this? What about that? And every single junction, she just turned it back to, oh, my husband, he worked in a factory in Bromsgrove, and it was this, and it was just hilarious. She was just a lonely little old lady, and she wanted to chat, and she thought, I'm going to waste this guy's time completely. And we walked out the door afterwards, and I'd been trying not to literally like laugh in his face for about half an hour.
I love the thought of just someone being in between that, which of course.
Yeah. And we got outside, she shut the door, and I said, well, she just taught you a lesson there, mate. And he turns around to me and he goes, oh, fuck off. If I'd have had my booker sample, she'd have been signed up for one today. And I mean, it couldn't have been less far from reality, but he just,
two questions there.
Yeah.
Two questions. One, why didn't he have his book of samples? And two, how do people like that just navigate life? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know how old he is or was. Who knows? But wow. And didn't you hand in your notice the next day?
Yeah. I woke up and I felt so awful about the day that had been before. And I thought, well, I can't quit after one day. And on the drive there, I decided, there's no way, I'm too good for this. I'm sorry that I'm not working with this caliber of people. And I drove all the way, walked into the office and went, right, well, I resign. And
Wow.
he tried to turn me around and sort of being like, "Oh, you've lost your ball, mate. That's what's happened." And I was just like, "No, I just realised I'm too good for this job. See ya,"
Good for you,
and
man.
quit and went home.
I suppose, yeah, I mean, you make the point of maybe it is a necessary term, IDM, but or at least something to set it apart from the likes of some drum and bass I've got time for, but then you've got, I mean, I'm not an expert, but obviously you've got stuff like jungle, well, trance, gabba, and I mean, the worst dubstep. I mean,
Mm,
it's just pummeling you with just different noises. That there's, I mean, we talk about the exercise of restraint, and trust me, as we get further along this musical series, that's going to be more of a recurring factor, I think. So as we're quite early on, we may as well address this now. I've got no time for music that just can't cope with a millisecond without something different happening. It's like it caters to the least patient, or it's hard to. Well, I mean, I say I don't want to offend anyone, but frankly, if you're listening and you're into dubstep, bugger off. I don't want you as a
yeah,
listener.
get
So
out.
yeah, I suppose IDM. It's a necessary evil term, and I suppose while we're in this area of the world, Loz, I do just want to give a quick mention to Aphex Twin, aka Richard D. James, because he probably is the most well known in this world, and for good reason, it must be said. He's brilliant. After a bit of a hiatus, I mean, actually, I say hiatus. I think he's always been quite a compulsive creator, but he didn't release anything for a lengthy period of time. And then he did finally release a quite lengthy album and a quite divisive one called Drux, if that's how you spell it, how you pronounce it. It's Drukqs. I'm going to call it Drux. That's my personal favorite. And again, the track titles aren't any more quotable, to be honest. I mean, there's one he does, which is a standout to me, which is called Cock/VER10, as in like version 10, Cock/VER10, which like it has a moment in it that just, I mean, funnily enough, you were talking about, blasting something out through a sub that just earth shattering, If I was given that setup and it was like, put on one tune, Scott, just see how it comes out, I'd probably pick that by Aphex Twin because it's just ridiculous. And I'm almost about to negate what I just said with dubstep, but this is different with Aphex Twin because there's an awful lot going on, but there's an artistry. It's a tapestry of different things. It's been very painstakingly and lovingly created with a great deal of skill and kind of vision, I guess, which just that none of those words strike me when I listen to dubstep, which is equally busy. Do you get what I mean? But Aphex Twin's Drux is very busy. It's full of things like that, but it's a deliberate aesthetic, I think, for that album, and it works. It just works. And there's this bit like in that's just for me like really quite crushing. I know that's not heavy is necessarily a term you'd associate with this type of music. You'd think more about some bands that are probably coming up, Loz. I would attribute crushing and heavy, those two words to this. At the end of Cock/VER10 or whatever it is. It's just, I had to mention that, and indeed him along this little festival that we're on.
And speaking of things that you've got to mention, I feel like I need to once again sort of pinch my nose and jump headfirst into the pool of this discussion. But yeah, basically, I just had again something come to mind, and it illustrates so beautifully what say, for example, I wasn't necessarily aware of the original. It was a song that I was made aware of through Kill Bill, and that's is it Nancy Sinatra? The My Baby Shot Me Down.
Yeah, bang bang.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And I remember hearing, I think it's drum and bass, or whether it might be considered dance or whatever. But I just remember the first time that I heard someone had done a remix to that, and it was like my baby shot me down, 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 and I just felt ill to my stomach. I was just like, it's such a beautiful, delicate song, and I was just like, you just wipe your ass with it.
It's heinous drivel. And just callous, to reprise something in that way. And funnily enough, Lars, whilst we're on this topic, and indeed Aphex Twin, Kanye West stole, and it was off this album, Drux. Actually, it's a beautiful piano piece called Avril 14th. Lovely. And if you like Kanye West, listen to Avril 14th, and you'll recognize it because he stole it. So yeah. Anyway, that's
Yeah, disgrace. Sort yourself out, Kanye. What are you doing?
Yeah, so let's go as far away from Kanye West as possible, and indeed as far away from IDM, Plaid Aphex as possible. Let's go into something very different. Right, so as that little interlude perhaps suggested, let's chill it, or let's remain chilled. And well, in fact, no, that Aphex twin I just thought that was far from chilled, but. In terms of the main artists that have been at this festival so far, or at least today, let's remain chilled. And in fact, we're going back as far as the late 60s, early 70s here, Lars.
Oh,
and I'll allow you to guess again in a second. I mean, there are two surnames we're probably all aware of that came up in the first episode that we did on music, I think. So, Lars, you're about to tell us what they are.
Well, if I didn't know their names, I'd say hello, Mrs. Robinson. But it's old Simon and Garfunkel, isn't it?
It is. Well done. Now, these guys almost built a career out of kind of two distinctly different sounds, albeit both based largely around an acoustic guitar, but they could have a very upbeat and rocky side to them. I mean, you mentioned Mrs. Robinson, and the first album, Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m. I mean, all of their albums have got these rocky tracks on, but yeah, if you think Mrs. Robinson, that's kind of about as rocky as you can get with an acoustic, isn't it? And no percussion or anything. But then perhaps more famously, like some very kind of haunting, melancholic pieces as well. Scarborough Fair, Bridge Over Troubled Water. I mean, even Sounds of Silence, the original Wednesday Morning 3 a.m. version, of course, which is very, very gentle, very lilting, and the harmonic vocals, of course, being quite a key part of this. Bands nowadays like First Aid Kit and the Pierces are kind of doing this. But then you've always had the likes of the Beach Boys, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young doing that kind of harmonic vocal stuff. But I've always had a huge soft spot for Simon and Garfunkel. Like I think I said before, that they've kind of been there during some really dark times where listening to them has really helped. I mean, I couldn't not mention them. And their best album, and again, probably only just outside my top 10 really, is Bookends, which features Mrs. Robinson actually, but also my favorite track they ever did, which is America. In fact, I mentioned First Aid Kit a second ago. They do a lovely cover of the song America in front of a quite tearful Paul Simon, who's very moved by the performance. It's amazing.
It's amazing how powerful your own work can be when represented by somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, there's a shot of him in the crowd, quite tearful, but looking just totally kind of almost like he's under paralysis. He's just like looking, very intently at the performance. And then I scrolled down the YouTube comments, and someone said something like, "quote unquote, oh God, I've left the oven on," and then. And then I couldn't not think of that again when I saw that, and I thought, oh, as funny as that is, it's almost ruined that moment for me now, because he's just taken aback at how moving and stirring this performance of his own song is. But then someone just found the perfect caption for it, which just amused me no end.
Chip, chip, chow.
Great stuff.
Yeah. So that's Simon and Garfunkel. Right, into another lilting, beautiful artist now, and this time solely with a piano, Lars. And I probably wouldn't expect you to remember this guy's name, so I'm just going to come.
Yes, go straight into it because I've got nothing.
Max Richter.
Yeah.
But again, like with Sigur Rós, we've probably all heard Max Richter without realizing we've heard him, because he has lent his piano and I suppose brain to many soundtracks over the years, notably Shutter Island, Lars. Arguably his most famous piece, which is called On the Nature of Daylight. If you were to Google that or YouTube it, you'd immediately recognize it, I would imagine. He did the soundtrack to a Black Mirror episode, which I love, called Nosedive. That's the Bryce Dallas Howard one, in the sort of social scoring nightmare. But he's done all sorts of soundtracks and scores to TV series and films and things like that. But I suppose his studio albums are worth the biggest mention. One in particular, well, in fact, he did a recent wonderful album called Voices, which features the Declaration of Human Rights being read out. I know that doesn't necessarily sound enthralling, but it works, trust me. Well, I can tell you it works because he did a Voices Part 2, so it was obviously successful. But before that, or before those, he did my favorite thing he's ever done, which is an 8-hour-long album called Sleep.
Sleep, that's it, yeah.
Yeah, which, is an apt name, but also because it's the perfect thing to put that record on for. I mean, he even did an overnight live performance of the album where there were a bunch of beds set out in the audience who actually slept to it. I know that sounds bizarre, but there's an amazing documentary that covers that whole thing. I think it's on iPlayer. And yeah, Sleep is very dear to me because it accompanied my writing of my book. And in fact, I actually mentioned this in the book towards the end. It is kind of the unofficial soundtrack to it, as far as I'm concerned, because probably the majority of the writing of it was accompanied by that music.
Wow.
So it's, and subsequently, if I ever hear this record now or a piece from it, it does amazing things in terms of, I mean, nostalgia is probably not the right term because it was only like really last year that I was writing it. You know what I mean, don't you? Well, I guess sentiment.
It's evocative of a time and a place.
Many times and many places, really, all combined. There's just a crashing wave of sentiment, comes down over me whenever I hear anything off that record. So yeah, that's Max Richter, and I mean, well, to try and stick with recommending a piece of music, I suppose I'd say On the Nature of Daylight, just because you'll realize then that you've heard his work probably.
And just to say the whole of Sleep was 8.5 hours is probably a bit much of a dip your toe in sort of experience.
Yeah, you could pause this and go off for 9 hours and come back, but you'd probably forget where we were, and I just wouldn't recommend it really.
And clearly this is the most important.
I imagine you've probably got other things to do in your life. I don't know where you're listening right now, if you're at home or on the train or whatever, but I'd imagine you've probably got something on in the next 9 hours. So that's why I'm not recommending Sleep really. But right. Oh, okay, right. So I've just got to the next artist, Laz. Now, I mean, of course, you'll remember discussing this artist recently, but I mean, I don't know how I can really segue. Well, no, maybe I can. So anyway, we just had Max Richter. And before that, some works of just pure beauty and I guess relaxation, really, serenity, all those things. And this artist started out in that area. You know I'm getting out already, don't you?
Yeah.
All right. So this is an artist I've always been fascinated with, and it is because he went from like a budding pop career, and indeed being somewhat of a heartthrob, really, to taking a long break of perhaps a decade or so, and then quite simply the biggest change of direction there's perhaps ever been in music. You'll name him at this point, Loz?
It's Scott Walker.
It is. Originally of fame with the Walker Brothers, and then he went off to do his own thing, which kind of followed a similar trend for a while, this kind of operatic crooning, I guess. But then he made an album called Climate of Hunter, which was quite boldly different, really, and hinted at somewhat of a slightly darker shift in tone. And then he followed it up a few years later with a record called Tilt, which I'd perhaps say is his best, to be honest. But then maybe about 12 years after that, again, quite a prolonged period of silence, he made another album, which is quite possibly the darkest and most evil piece of music ever created, really. It's called The Drift.
Yes.
And for those that have heard The Drift, I guarantee they will never forget it. Although I'm sure many have probably tried to. It starts out with something relatively conventional. Even though at one point it features like a basketball being bounced for its percussion. But I mean, it's certainly still a sinister and foreboding piece of music. But believe me when I say that's nothing compared to the utter madness that the album descends into from sort of track 2 onwards. But I mean, seriously, some of the darkest sounds you've ever heard. I mean, even with it just being audio, it's still enough to conjure up some like awful, like horrific imagery. And this kind of goes on for about 40 minutes in different forms and flavors, and well, it all kind of builds to a song called The Escape, which after, actually there's a little bit of a lull, for maybe 2 tracks. They do lull you really into a full sense of security before The Escape happens. And he goes into, and it won't sound evil when I say it, but he essentially does a Donald Duck impression, but which you've heard, I think, Loz.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
But it's so easy to laugh, but it's horrifying when you hear it. I mean,
oh yeah,
and the backing music with it. This song just has the ultimate sense of dread. This album really is all about dread and despair, I think. I mean, he's not necessarily one of my favorite artists, but I did want to mention him because his career is fascinating. And there's a documentary on the making of this album, which shows some of the interesting things that he did to create some of the sounds on this record. For example, him punching a side of pork on a table.
Yeah. So some of the choices of percussion and stuff is really really out there from what I remember.
I know, and there's like the sound of a donkey being terrified at one point. I mean, it's you don't know how to react to comments like that, do you? I mean, especially if you haven't heard it. But believe me when I say, when you're listening to it, it's dark, it's vile. I mean,
oh yeah,
it's something I think everyone should hear, just so they can say they've experienced a form of artistic output they never would have even realized existed. And I'm sure most would run away, long before finishing the album or even getting anywhere near this track, The Escape. But I'm just fascinated by it. And it's important for me to say that it's a very beautiful album in places. But yeah, Scott Walker The Drift, please go and listen to it. And don't hold me accountable for any nightmares that result. I mean, if I was to try and recommend a track, I'm actually reticent to say The Escape, because part of the impact of that is having heard the preceding 30-40 minutes of the record that just set that tone, and you're in that world. You're in that world when you hear The Escape. But I would imagine anyone who's intrigued listening to this would just go off and search The Escape, and yeah, fair enough, listen to that and at least you'll know what I mean.
If you've got enough intrigue to make it through sort of 5 minutes or so, then you're in for the long haul, and fair play.
It's an experience to get through that album from start to end, especially with headphones. If you're doing it properly to immerse yourself in it, I guarantee it's an experience you won't forget, and I think a worthwhile one. I really do. It's
sure.
Yeah, but I'm drawn to things like that. It's the same with films. If something's caused a fuss or controversy, I need to see it to see what the fuss is about, and that's led me to watching some pretty horrific films at times, like Salo or a Serbian film or Irreversible. But like I'm still glad I've watched them and experienced that type of art at the same time. As long as it's art, and not like violence or something for the sake of it, then I can appreciate it as art. And I would definitely say that about Irreversible. That's a film that's an experience. But we've gone through film, haven't we? And I didn't bring that film up there.
So I was going to say, as ever, we're off the freeway, sliding down the embankment, and it's time for a fast sort of spin of the wheel and the foot on the floor.
That's it. Well, you sort of dangled the rope there, and I've grabbed it, Loz, and I'm back up. So Scott Walker The Drift. But it is art. It is definitely art. It's not just someone trying to be horrible. And there are some very interesting themes that are being discussed lyrically or explored lyrically and stuff. So yeah, Scott Walker's The Drift is an album that I think everyone should experience.
Well, I mean, certainly, obviously, I think a lot of things could be taken out of context and seem ambiguous, but you could take each bit in sort of separation and sort of go, okay, I'm not really sure what's going on here, but I've found, in the few times that I'd listened to the album, that there was a lot of very deliberate choices being made, and I thought that was fascinating. It was clearly, it was with some people's music, you can sort of almost, especially if they're trying to go for like a big sound or trying to convey a sense of fear, that they go almost like a wall of noise. And actually, with this album in particular, it was a very deliberate set of sounds and circumstances that he was trying to get his feelings across in.
Yeah, and I mean, there are like jarring moments where the contrast between silence and then just this wall of like, but no, absolutely, what Loz just said there, that there's a lot that's being explored on a minimal level that just distills this tone of just unease, and it's that stuff that scares me, I guess, on the album. Rather than just, well, like when we talked about horrors, it's the same thing applies really. It's yeah, there's nothing cheap on the album in terms of just like nastiness, or it's not like that, but it's an unpleasant listen, and it's meant to be. So yeah,
it's so deliberate. That's what I find intriguing about it. Right down to, as we've said before, the choice of what actually makes the sound that captures what he's going for. I think that's incredible.
Yeah. Right. I think I've got three bands left for today with a headliner at the end. So these probably won't take as long to talk about, I would imagine. Scott Walker needed if he was going to get mentioned, he needed the time to just try and convey what the experience is like, and indeed how he got there in his career. Anyway, we're talking about Scott Walker again. I could quite happily carry on. And then he did an album after the Drift called Bish Bosh, which is really good. I think that's the one he said was his favorite. And then he died. So rest in peace, Scott Walker, no more. Anyway,
sorry, I shouldn't be laughing. There was just something quite jolly about the way he went, and then he died. As if that was his grand finishing sort of and I'm done.
Dead.
Yeah.
I apologize. I don't mean to make light of that, of course. Anyway, right, here's an artist who is quite possibly the only one out there at the moment who's anywhere close to the level of insanity that Scott Walker was.
Jesus.
So yeah, it's the genre of madness, shall we say. And quite an incredible artist who again has an album that kind of just missed out on my top 10. And it's a solo artist, and it's another solo French artist. There was Demians, who I mentioned in the last one. But this is a guy named Gautier Serra.
I remembered Gautier, but other than that, sorry, go on.
Can you name the actual artist name, Loz?
It's Igor, isn't it?
It is Igor with 3 R's, in case you want to go off and search Igor. And I would recommend that you do, because hearing Igor is often a religious experience for people, because there's nothing else like it. I mean, if I say Baroque black metal and everything in between, you're not going to say, "Oh, this old chestnut." I've heard enough of that. It's totally unique. And his latest record is a masterpiece called Spirituality and Distortion. But I suppose I want to give a shout out to the one before, which is called Savage Sinusoid, which I personally think was his most concise and masterful. The first half in particular is, again, a real journey. I talked about with Plaid, Tech on Concrete soundtrack, the first kind of 4 tracks just being like a perfect, I don't know, just almost like a banquet, of like, this is what to start with, 4 things that sum up everything. And I guess the first 5 tracks, or the first half of Savage Sinusoid, is like that. And it's crazy, but somehow cohesive at the same time, which is a perfect description of another album, actually, which ranks much higher, which we'll get to much later. But check out the documentary of the making of Savage Sinusoid. I'd almost recommend that before actually listening to a track, because it's just a really entertaining and well-made, well-edited documentary. And it shows the array of musicians he worked with as well, who are like virtuosos on their respective instruments, which include things like harpsichord, accordion, classical guitar, sitar. Like it's incredible. Yeah, it's again a bit like Scott Walker's The Drift. It's an album that everyone should hear, just so you can experience it. I suppose I would recommend a song to start with. I'd go with Hummus, which I think is,
and then some music.
Hey! It's a nice little showcase of what he's about in the space of about 3 minutes. So I'd probably go with that. And it also features his chicken, Patrick, who had a cameo appearance on every album, this being his last, God rest his soul. And then followed by a sort of 8-bit Nintendo outro, which is just funk beyond, my ability to convey, really. Just listen to it and make sure you listen to the end. Right, just for the sake of time, we're sticking with metal here, Lars. This is a band that you mentioned in the last episode, I think, but before I did. And we're going somewhat in a doomier direction with them. They're a band that I suppose you would call post-metal. And in that genre, you might think of Neurosis, maybe, or the rather unfortunately named ISIS, named long before any of that business came about. But no, these guys are the pinnacle of that genre for me. And I've had the fortune of seeing them live a couple of times. And Loz, in tradition now, do you want to name them, please?
I do believe this is Cult of Luna, isn't it?
Cult of Luna, yeah.
Yeah.
One of Sweden's finest. They've made some very atmospheric albums down the years. Very crushing. You know, I said the word crushing would come up later on, and here it is. Very, very fitting term for Cult of Luna. But also very melodic and very beautiful. And really, I like one kind of informs the other in terms of the dynamics of how their long tracks often play out. And it kind of means that they both shine, you know, especially when they're so good at both of them. I mean, I'll learn and just insert a riff at either end of the spectrum, just to give you an example.
Nice.
Because, yeah, they could be incredibly beautiful at times and then absolutely brutal in others. And I believe it was Gaz that first coined the term brutiful, which is perfect for them. It's perfect. So, yeah, I mean, I'll throw in a riff from each at some point during this little bit, and just to give you an idea of each end of the spectrum. Though, to be fair, an electroclassical guitar can only sound so brutal, really. I mean, you might get a sense of it just through the chords, but yeah, it's not going to be half as brutal as it is listening to them.
Well, I mean, they really are. I mean, again, you know, I'm far less familiar with them than you are, but the thing that I always got from them was the sense of layering in the music and the overall atmosphere. I could really picture sort of like boss battles, you know, in certain video games, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and they have three guitarists. This came up, didn't it, in the last episode? Two drummers and three guitarists. I think there's 9 of them in total or something. I mean, the first album I ever heard from them was Eternal Kingdom, which is possibly their most famous, based on a diary that was supposedly found and picked up from an abandoned mental asylum. And it revolves around like a mythical owl god character. In fact, the first track on that album is called Owlwood, which is the first song I ever heard by them. And immediately I liked them. But the outro to Owlwood is gorgeous. Maybe that's the bit I'll learn just to demonstrate, you know, the lighter things that they can do, because I think it's lovely. And criminally, they seem to just leave it whenever they play it live. They just skip that bit. They don't play the outro. Yeah. So it's on the album, but whenever they play it live, and I've seen them play it live twice, they don't play the outro. So I'm going to play it because it needs to be recognized. I mean, but their best album is called Salvation. And again, it's almost kind of the ultimate journey of an album. You know, it goes through the spectrum of sonics, light and dark, almost like, you know, the equivalent of 2001 Space Odyssey, I guess. Just that might sound weird, but I can sense something between the two of them that's shared, even if I can't necessarily explain what it is. And it's, I suppose, again, to liken it to 2001, it's the album of theirs that I could perhaps listen to the least, but just be like satisfied with the longest, you know, and only return to when I'm absolutely in the mood for that whole journey as it should be experienced. And a special quick mention to their greatest song ever, which is from a different album called Somewhere Along the Highway. And that song is Dark City Dead Man. Quite incredible. Loz, you were talking about, you know, it being the soundtrack to a boss fight potentially or something like that. I could hear this song being literally the soundtrack to the end of the world. if meteors were crashing down and it was like the apocalypse, I'd probably put that track on. Like, I can't think of a more fitting way to go out. It's epic beyond words.
Wow.
I mean, both times I saw them live was epic. I mean, Gaz, I mentioned it. If you're listening, yeah, we went to Paris, of course, just to see this band, which, despite only going there for that one thing and then coming back, was actually quite an eventful little trip, really. But then a few years later, I actually got to meet and interview them backstage, when I worked for an internet radio station. I don't know if I've said that at any point, but yeah, I used to host a radio show. And yeah, I very luckily got the opportunity to sort of review certain albums before they came out, or go and review bands and interview them. And my favorite, of course, the highlight of that whole thing for me was definitely Cult of Luna. Yeah, I got to interview them backstage in Wolverhampton. I've still got my press pass for that somewhere. It's in fact, that interview's on YouTube somewhere. If you search TBFM Cult of Luna, you'll hear myself and Si interviewing them, which was really cool. Right, Loz, shall we?
Yep, go on. Sorry.
Shall we close? Actually, this band, when we did the dress rehearsal, if you like, with the lost recordings, we actually stopped at this point and then opened the next episode with this band. But I actually think it makes sense to put this band in at this stage to even out the episode lengths and keep them consistent. But also because, it's day 2 of this honorary festival of mentions. You've got to close with a proper headliner, haven't you?
You do, really, yeah.
Yeah, and Cult of Luna, as much as I adore them, when I name this band, you'll see why they're probably a little bit more worthy of...
I like Cult of Luna too, but they're not top billing, are they?
They sort of are for me, but then I only represent one ticket, don't I, in terms of sales to a festival. I think, if you were considering the everyone, the hedonic calculus, do you remember that, Loz? Weighing up the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
Oh, I see. Yes, yeah.
That was back when we did our little situation ethics video in yeah. Now you remember.
Yeah,
going back to school days. But this band is a worthwhile, worthy way to close a day at a festival. It's Tool.
Ah, yes.
Fred Durst's favorite band. I know. Like, I remember him saying it. It was, when about the time Chocolate Starfish was out and Lateralis was out and Schism, that video was all over Kerrang for a while. Yeah, but anyway, I actually don't wish to talk too much about that part of Tool's career, because if I'm being honest with you, and this has always been quite a divisive comment whenever I've said it before, I always thought they were a bit overrated during those days. They did an album called Enema, and then they did Lateralis, which had some great moments on it, absolutely. But the level of reverence, God tier band, I never quite got. But then after that, they did 10,000 Days, which I do like a lot more, even if it's not necessarily considered their magnum opus. I think it should be discussed in that breath. It's very, very good. Beautiful album.
It's perhaps, dare I say, a little bit more accessible.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I mean, 10,000 Days is probably the one where they do strike the balance between typical Tool time signatures and that kind of thing. But then, tracks like The Pot, which is, that's a great track to start with if you haven't heard Tool before. It's just, it's undeniably catchy. And I love The Pot. I think it's one of the tracks I would revisit the most in their career.
Great video too.
Yeah, I mean, fantastic record in general, 10,000 Days. But the one I kind of want to focus on is the most recent one, which, it followed a lengthy period of silence, about 13 years. But they weren't necessarily completely withdrawn from making or doing music for that period of time. They had an ongoing lawsuit battle represented a big chunk of those 13 years. But anyway, the album finally came out in 2019, and it was called Fear Inoculum. Still is called Fear Inoculum. And I'm not sure many fans knew quite what to make of it at first. I mean, the fact that there'd been such a wait would, of course, factored into how it was immediately received. I've got to admit, when I first heard it, I absolutely fell in love with it. Like, for me personally, almost, based on some of the backlash they had, it's almost as if this album was written for me. Because I adore it from start to end. And I did from the first time I heard it. Like, it was like a blessing to me, especially after a pretty rough year for me, 2019. I heard that album and I thought, oh, this is like the album I kind of always hoped they would make. The album I always thought they had in them. And here it was. And I mean, now, almost 2 years since its release, and I still very frequently listen to this. I absolutely love it. all the tracks are quite well. There are some kind of little interlude pieces, but the majority, the bulk of the album, are quite long pieces of music, all kind of upwards of 10 minutes, I'd say. All brilliant in different ways. They've got that core, unmistakable Tool sound to them, but there's just something about the artistry of this record that, for me, I think is by far their best album. I think Meshuggah said it was Tool's best album when they heard it. I don't know why no one else really seems to agree, but I think just such is the love and reverence for like the Lateralis Enema period. I mean, I think fair enough, of course, fair enough, but just doesn't do as much for me. Lars, where do you stand with this band?
I like Tool. I can't say as I've really deep dived into all of their albums and listened to every track. I always remember it is funny what comes to mind, isn't it? But I always remember I think it's Lateralis that I remember seeing played on I do apologize if I'm getting this wrong. I think it was traditional Japanese, almost like xylophone style instruments. And the way they obviously each sort of different section picked a different instrument to sort of mimic, but the way it again sort of layered and all built towards and all the rest of it, it was sort of serenely beautiful. And also, you having heard the original track, it stayed with me forevermore. And there's obviously the part, I mean, we've already spoken about it, but that's my absolute favorite go-to track. And I do like Schism as well. That's another good track.
The thing with like Tool, and I can imagine, particularly if you were watching a video where someone else was doing it with those kind of instruments, it's almost like a display of the time signature more than the melody. And that's kind of my point, really. Like, Tool do a lot of very interesting things with their time signatures. I mean, there's one piece of music, I think it might be Lateralis, where it's the Fibonacci sequence, like with the time signature, which is very interesting. But to me, I almost feel like that's quite, again, one of my favorite words, it would seem, quite formulaic. I'm not having a go at them in any way, because I do really like Lateralis. But that's the point. I really like Lateralis, whereas 10,000 Days I really, really like. And then Fear Inoculum, I love. It's one of my favorite albums. It's not made the top 10, which is why
it's really interesting for me, this concept of almost like therapeutic music, which is something that I don't quite have the same, and I'm a little bit jealous, actually, in a way.
I mean, Maynard Keenan, the vocalist, has got quite a therapeutic voice at times. There's one of my favorite tracks on Fear Inoculum, which, again, even for those who are fans of the album, don't necessarily cite this as one of the best, but it's called Culling Voices. And the first, half of the track is just beautiful. It's almost something lullaby-like about it. And Maynard's voice has a big part to play in that. He has got a very, well, in this case, just a very lilting kind of voice, beautiful voice. And the voice is a big thing for me, with an artist. I mean, Scott Walker, we just talked about, didn't we?
Yeah.
He's got a voice that could put you off. And there's bands coming up. In fact, I've just looked ahead to day 3, Lars, and there's a band that's coming up quite early on there where we'll probably get more into that discussion of vocals there. Because again, very divisive voice. But and you'll know what I mean when I get to it. But yeah, Tool, I'm just a big fan of Tool nowadays. Beforehand I was kind of a fan of them, but now Tool just finally did what I'd always wanted them to do. But they had to be mentioned, and Fear Inoculum, is a masterpiece for me. But yeah, sure. I suppose to close this out, to close out day 2, and try and think of a track to start with, I'd probably recommend The Pot, and I'm sure Loz would agree.
Oh, definitely.
Just really catchy, isn't it?
Bang it on YouTube, get the video in there as well. Wrap your goggle box around that, yep.
Eloquently put, as always.
You know me.
Shove that up your fucking bollocks.
Right, yeah, I'm not going to top that, actually, yeah. Congratulations, sir.
Well, on that note, thank you everyone for listening. We love you as always. Thank you for talking and listening, Loz. Predominantly listening. I do apologize that I've occupied the vast majority of this. I'm aware of that. I'm not necessarily happy about it. It's just I wanted to mention these bands.
Well, it's not Mastermind, but it might as well be your specialist subject, mightn't it? So, where I think allowances can be made.
I hope so, yeah, because I'm sure this will even out over, as we get into other topics. And so let me assure you that day 3 is an absolute belter. We've got some nice variation there. Not so many bands to talk about, actually, but the reason I've kind of divvied it up between this episode, day 2, and the next one is, well, you'll see why when we get to it, because there's a band that, let's call them the headliner of the entire festival, shall we, Loz? And yeah. Loz knows, and he's also a fan. So I can't wait to discuss them with you again, of course, because
again,
yeah. But, all right, well, yes, thank you very much, and we'll see you on day 3. Get a good night's rest. Don't go off and get too battered. Wake up nice and fresh for day 3, and we will see you there.
And all I've got to say is deja vu vuvuzela.
Christ. Yeah, all right.
Chip, chip, chow.